Hey, happy Friday. We have kind of almost survived January, and what do you know it? Today we're going to be talking about The Survivalists by Kashana Cauley, and I promise that is the only potential dad joke that I have planned for this evening. But then again, I'm mostly flying by the seat of my pants on any given day, so who knows what could happen. But I picked this up by happenstance. I didn't have this on my radar at all. So I picked this up at the bookstore through that gem of pure discovery, and I also believe it is published by an independent press that is distributed through Penguin Random House. And I only looked into it, well, one, I was checking the publisher, obviously, because I wanted to make sure it wasn't a HarperCollins title and that I could talk about it today when I picked it up and was interested in it. And then when I realized it was an independent publisher, I was confused by the level of hardcover, just because hardcovers are expensive, and realized that it was distributed through Penguin Random House. That being said, it is still published through Soft Skull. I checked with my Penguin Random House rewards program, and it is not eligible, so it is through the indie publisher. And I picked this up because it was on the front table. I was looking for something new. Like I said, my library holds had been kind of slow trickling in at the beginning of the year, and I also realized based on what was coming in and what I am interested in reading next, just from a purely personal perspective, that if I wasn't careful, I could end up talking about books related to fairies for like 3 or more weeks in a row, which probably either sounds delightful or like your worst nightmare, but I wanted to keep some variety in things. So I'm hoping ideally next week to talk about either The Stolen Heir or Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, depending on if my hold on Emily Wilde comes in time. If you have a preference there, hold depending, let me know, but that's the plan. Ideally, I wanted and had planned to read and review Unseelie, but that is a HarperCollins title, and in December, I thought for sure that would be resolved, and it has not been. So my library hold came in, and I'm just kind of staring at it despondently. But in the meantime, I went to the bookstore and saw this on the front table. I don't remember kind of coming across this cover when I was researching January Anticipated. I 100% probably looked at it and just didn't register it. However, at the front of the bookstore, you've got a more limited selection, so it stood out a little bit more. And as I was kind of flipping through, my eye went to the blurbs, honestly, because on the inside flap, there is a blurb from Disha Filia, who wrote The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, and then on the back, there is a blurb from Kelly Link, who writes short stories that are weird and I adore. And then, honestly, last, my eye went to the Trevor Noah blurb, and I looked at the author's biography, and I'm not familiar with the author's work independently. I believe she has a following on Twitter, and according to her bio, she wrote for The Daily Show, so that makes sense. But what really caught me here after the cover and these blurbs, and the blurbs are more kind of like situating what I'm going to expect for this novel. So from Disha Filia and Kelly Link in particular, those are both short story writers that I've really loved. And Filia writes a little bit more realistically, but really at the heart of emotions and digging into the kind of uglier and stark underbellies of people, but not in a kind of moshfay type way. There is still a lot of heart and compassion. At least that's how I read her stories. And Kelly Link is just odd stories, but finding the humanity and the compassion amidst the odd and using the odd to kind of illuminate that. So I was very interested in where this book was going to situate itself, especially with a title like The Survivalists. And the jacket copy talks about our protagonist Aretha, who is a perpetually single young Black lawyer, and her main focus in life is success and her career until she meets this guy Aaron on a date and kind of falls for him, and this brings her into his lifestyle. And I'm going to read from the blurb itself here. Aretha finds herself putting her career and personal moral code at risk to enter an underground world of selling illegal weapons and training for a doomsday that may be just around the corner. So we are looking at survivalists as we would generally think of them. And then there is also a comparison to The Sellout by Paul Beatty within the blurb jacket copy, and that is a largely satirical kind of extreme novel. So I was expecting this to push things to the extremes, which it does, but in a much different way than I think I anticipated. But it has such a good hook to it. The first like 20-ish pages or so are just so masterful and fast-paced, and there is a kind of wryness and cynicism to the voice, but it is also just very funny, and not necessarily in a laugh-out-loud Talia Hibbert kind of funny, but definitely this strong undercurrent and this kind of not taking anything too seriously. And as a single woman in her 30s, I appreciated the opening line that reads, "Aretha stood in front of her dresser, waiting for something in her wardrobe to declare itself up to the existential challenge of her third first date in a week." Actually, no, I'm gonna read the rest of the paragraph and forgive my reading ability here because it's just so good, and I think that it is good enough that it will be worth kind of muddling through my reading ability here. The first guy scratched his neck too much and filled conversational holes by obsessing over taxes. He rattled off deductions with the excitement of a 6-year-old listing their favorite types of candy, while Aretha wondered if she was already dead. The second guy called himself a visual storyteller, instead of admitting he was a guy who made abstract, plotless movies only his mother was willing to watch. So there's this kind of blunt, sarcastic, maybe millennial tone that as a millennial really spoke to me. And the way that we were kind of setting everything up, I expected things to just snowball and become even more absurd. Because at its heart, this is a social commentary about surviving in the world today. But it took a little bit different route than I anticipated. So Aretha goes on this date and it goes wonderfully. She meets this guy, Aaron, who is a coffee entrepreneur, and they end up hitting it off. And part of them hitting it off is that both of their parents are dead. And Aretha said that there is just this understanding there that she doesn't feel like she has to explain her parents' absence. And her kind of flashing back to the trauma of losing her parents, who died in a car crash with a deer in Wisconsin when she was in college, is kind of permeating the novel. And kind of the absurdity of it and how it is talked about, and this idea of these antlers haunting her in a way, but also being from the Midwest, that is an unfortunately very realistic scenario potentially. So there is just this mix of the realistic and the absurd. And at the beginning of the novel, it really feels like the absurd is gonna win out, and it does gradually become more absurd, right? So we cut from Aretha and Aaron's initial date to Aaron's roommates, Brittany and James, as they are on essentially a gun run, and the kind of comedic disaster of that event. But that is also honestly the most active of that I think we see. Everything else kind of becomes in passing or on the periphery. This is very much a character-driven novel. It is driven by Aretha. There are large chunks of just prose. When the dialogue is there, it is cutting and sharp, but we are really in this kind of existential dread bubble for a lot of the novel. And that did kind of surprise me because even just knowing the kind of bare hint of the author's biography and that she has written for TV, part of me wondered if this was going to read like it wanted to be a movie. Like, would it feel like a madcap adventure? And in certain ways, yes, we did have those absurd angles, but because it was so interior driven, I don't know that the humor would read on screen in the same way. I definitely think it could be done, but I think certain parts of it would be heightened and other parts we would obviously have to draw back on, because this is very much an internal journey with Aretha, and this is something that gets her out of her stasis as a lawyer and kind of a mid-level lawyer that is looking to make partner in a world where that's not really an option anymore. So she's just kind of scrambling around amidst her other associates. And when she moves into this house, she moves in with these people who are survivalists in their own way. And they all have something in their background that is kind of lingering or haunting them and that they are trying to prepare against for the future, whether it be a hurricane, which also links into a case Aretha is working at work. Yeah, words are great. Or James, who has kind of spiraled. He was a journalist who was caught plagiarizing and kicked out of the profession, and he's been kind of scrambling since then. Or Aaron, who seems to have it all together and claims he isn't as entrenched in this survivalist world and mindset as his roommates, like Brittany, who built a bunker in the backyard, and Brittany and James, who are selling guns on the side, but he is very kind of ostrich about it. He doesn't want to see it, he doesn't want to know. So at first I thought this was going to be centered around this whirlwind romance of sorts, but it quickly became evident that that wasn't really the focus of things, because Aaron started sliding into the background the minute that Aretha got into this house. So his function almost felt to get her into the house, to kind of upset her stasis, and then this house is about continuing to upset that stasis and her world. And so we're looking at how one or certain people kind of survive in the modern world and how that survival can be upset. And it really kind of looks at the daily slog of it all in a way that I wasn't anticipating. It almost begins to feel mundane in its absurdity. We understand a little bit why Aretha is looking for these moments of excitement and thrill and to kind of shake her out of this norm, even as we can recognize on the other side of things, outside of the kind of purview of the narrative, that this is like ridiculous happenings. And we do get one character, Aretha's long-term friend, Mia, who gives us a kind of outsider perspective on this. She's someone that can kind of drop into the world and still present an outside perspective of, oh yeah, this is still absurd. These things that are becoming normal for you are not normal. So in the plot, I honestly expected us to dive more into the world of survivalists and doomsday preppers, and I don't think we got all the way there. I was expecting this kind of subgroup to create the conflict for something kind of absurd to stem from these extracurricular activities, and instead the conflict was largely kind of man versus, not nature, but man versus society. It was a lot more kind of existential, as I said. And we did have this kind of comical, cynical, almost absurdist tone to everything. And as the narrative continued, it made the internal feel a little less genuine. It warped everything just a little bit. And so it was kind of an exploration of the modern world and how we exist in the modern world. And it almost felt more parallel to something that came out of like the modernist movements after World War I, World War II, than the kind of comedy and like action-filled comedy I was expecting. It was much more about kind of facing a world that isn't what we expected and looking at this idea of being a survivalist and all of the things that we have to prepare against. It is presented as this kind of extreme comical thing, but it is rooted in both personal and larger societal anxieties that are very true. We've got the idea of climate disaster. It's looking at this idea of what it means to be a millennial in the workforce and how our work trajectory isn't what we were promised. We have this woman who went to school to be a lawyer. She's incredibly successful. She's checked all of the boxes that we were told we needed to check to be successful, and yet she's still working 12-hour days, scrambling over these competitions that are presented to her and her coworkers that are almost a show for the partners, and there is no real way or avenue to move forward, and rather it's pitting people against each other. And then we're contrasting this with this idea of this home. The idea that Aaron owns a home where him and Brittany run this coffee business is appealing to Aretha. It is a sign of success in some ways. Quick side note, apologies if noise starts to come through. People are doing things, it's a day. You know how it goes. So there's this definite symbolism to this house becoming a fortress of sorts, and the way that it is also kind of crumbling. They're constantly spackling over the walls, and they're gaining what control they can for their lives in planning for future disasters or feeling prepared for future disasters. And so this book was a lot more symbolic than I was expecting, and it's really interrogating the anxieties of the modern age more than I anticipated. And so then we are kind of sprinkling the mundane with these bits of the absurd in a way that the absurd starts to feel less absurd, because we are kind of spiraling down with Aretha as things become more stressful at work and the world starts to warp a little bit. And so we're seeing her take control where she can. And so these reactions to anxieties feel a little bit more realistic, even as we as readers, I think, can still kind of pull back and recognize that this feels a lot more satirical than realistic. But there is a lot more existential dread, like I said, to this novel than I think I was expecting. And part of this is executed through the structure of the thing as well. It starts out very fast-paced, like I said, and we lose some of that momentum for sure as we go through because we're not really sure what we are moving toward. And I think that is part of the exploration of the novel, but it's really a more concept-driven thing, kind of held together by this strong voice. That being said, I did start to kind of lag a little bit, especially in the middle and toward the end. And I did peek at a review before I bought it because I was so drawn in by that opening bit. I read like the first page and a half, I think, in the bookstore, which is not something I normally do. I might read a few sentences to kind of get a feel for the thing, read the jacket copy, the blurb, what have you, but I don't think I've been organically drawn into an opening like I was with this one in quite some time. And I was expecting, especially with its comparison to The Sellout, for it to really push me as a reader. And this pushed a little bit into the absurd and the uncomfortable with the absurd, and that was mostly related to the idea of guns in the novel and how they were being handled, what was being done with them, and all of that. But even that, I felt like didn't push as far. That first opening scene was the most kind of madcap it got, and then it did kind of move into the mundane with everything else. And I think that there is something to be said about that. I think the fact that that did become mundane for Aretha was important, but the absurdity almost built in how normal everything started to look for our protagonists. That being said, the voice that I thought was so sparkling at the beginning, I think started to feel a little bogged down toward the end, especially as it became a little bit more clear where the symbolic parts of the novel were going and what we were saying with it, because that at the end of the day was what was driving the novel. And that was a little frustrating because I would have liked to see a little bit more plot or character driving of things. I know I said it was character driven, but even then I feel like a lot more character work could have been done. But also because this is a narrative that bends a little bit more satirical, characters are going to feel a little bit more two-dimensional. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, especially because this book is so interested in ideas. And I think that this is a great example of when something is succeeding or not at what it intends to do, what it sets out to execute, versus what I as a reader am personally looking for. I think this book 100% succeeds in what it is setting out to explore and how it is setting out to explore that. I think that I personally just wanted a little bit more action or a little bit more tied to the characters in that exploration, because I think that what it was digging at was really compelling, really interesting. We're dealing with a lot of big ideas here: climate, career, class, race, just relationships in your 30s, whether they be romantic or platonic. I think that the way that we popped in and out of Aretha's friendship with Nia and this idea that her longest standing closest friend was someone that she met for brunch every weekend or maybe every other weekend. It was kind of hard to tell with time in this novel. And I think that part of all of this was there were no chapters in this book. And I kind of struggled with this. It obviously forces you to interact with the text in a completely different way. You don't get breaks. It's a little bit denser then to get through, especially as the text itself started to get a little denser. However, as much as I found it a little bit more difficult as a reader, I also think it did exactly what it needed to do for the narrative. We weren't supposed to have breaks with this. It made it all feel a little fuzzier on purpose in a lot of ways. As these walls were coming down for these characters, they were also coming down for us in some ways. It unsettled us, it destabilized us in some ways, and it kept us on that precipice with everyone else, and also kind of gave some feelings of anxiety in the reading experience that mirror what our characters are dealing with. Because I do think it is looking at modern anxieties very intentionally. As I said, I mean, come on, Aretha's friend is a therapist. It is looking at the way that we are kind of on our own, stranded on our own in so many different different ways. So what does it mean to be in this rat race, and what does it mean to survive in this world? Because we are really looking at survival here, not thriving. And I think by not seeing the larger kind of community, in a lot of ways, we are very isolated to this house and to these people in this narrative. We're not really seeing the survivalist community, but we're not really working and living inside society at large either. We are just getting by. And at the end of the day, that's the whole point of the thing. What does it mean to survive in today's world? And what will we do to survive in today's world? So it was definitely not the novel I was expecting. And honestly, I don't know if I enjoyed it all the way through, but I also think it was incredibly successful at what it was doing. I think it had a very strong voice, especially at the beginning, even if that dulled a little bit to my reading experience toward the middle and end. But I also think it is exploring some big ideas amidst differing degrees of obviousness and opening some conversations that are easier to have with a little bit of humor sprinkled in. Because I do think it gets the tone of the particular absurdity of living in this day and age, being at this particular point of your life in this day and age, and whatnot. I think that the tone gets it right, and it makes it easier to engage with the ideas, and it's clear that this book wants those ideas engaged with. So if you read this, I would be very interested to hear what you thought of this particular brand of dark comedy and absurdism to kind of underline this social commentary. But thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Read something good, and yeah,